what does it take for a state to walk away from the Union? And I don't mean just getting mad about some new law or policy. Like, how do you get to the point where you actually secede, break away completely? Can you even imagine that today? It's wild, right? Florida did just that in 1861, and today we're going to explore why. Hey, y'all, this is Bo Carter, and welcome back to Old Florida Now.
Welcome to Old Florida Now, where we uncover the rich history and hidden stories of the Sunshine State. Each episode will explore the people, places, and events that shaped Florida's past. Let's dive in.
Now, I'll be honest, Florida's role in the Civil War is a part of our history that tends to get overshadowed by the bigger states, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, the ones that had massive battles and bigger populations. But Florida was right there early on taking a stand. So today we're going to talk about why Florida seceded from the Union in the first place, what the political landscape was like back then, and how this little old state contributed to the Confederate war effort. And spoiler alert, it wasn't just about sending soldiers off to fight. It was about feeding and supplying the entire Confederacy. So this is the first episode in our series on Florida's involvement and impact during the American Civil War. Over the next few weeks, we'll look at varying aspects of Florida's history in the Civil War. All right, let's back up for a second and paint the picture of Florida in the 1860s. Now, we weren't the tourism powerhouse we are today. No Disney World, no beaches packed with spring breakers. Heck, the population was pretty tiny, just about 140,000 folks in the whole state. And I got to say, almost half of those people, about 40%, were enslaved. So right off the bat, we've got this society that's built on agriculture, especially things like cotton, tobacco, and cattle. And that agriculture, it was run on the backs of enslaved people. You see, Florida's economy, like most of the South, was deeply tied to slavery. It's easy to look back now and think, well, of course it was wrong. But at the time, for a lot of folks in power, slavery wasn't just like a political issue. It was the issue. It was their whole way of life. If you threatened that, you weren't just making a philosophical argument. You were talking about taking away their livelihood, their economy. And when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, a lot of folks here in Florida saw it as a direct threat to that way of life. Now, Lincoln's election was kind of like the match that lit the fire for secession. He wasn't on the ballot in most southern states, including Florida, and yet he won. So think about that for a second. He became president without any support from the South, which made Southerners feel like they were being completely sidelined. And to top it off, Lincoln and the Republican Party were pretty clear about their stance on slavery. They didn't want it spread into new territories. And that was like a huge deal for states like Florida, where slavery wasn't just a part of life, it was the foundation of the economy. All right, so after Lincoln's election, the writing was on the wall. The southern states started talking seriously about breaking away. South Carolina was the first to do it in December 1860. Then Mississippi followed, and Florida was right behind them. On January 10th, 1861, Florida officially seceded from the Union, becoming the third state to do so. Now, that's a big moment, right? But it didn't happen overnight. There was actually a secession convention held in Tallahassee where state delegates gathered to vote on the issue. The vote was pretty decisive, 62 in favor of secession and only 7 against. So you can see there wasn't a whole lot of debate once it got going. The idea of staying in the Union just wasn't flying for most folks in power. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the political leaders here were all in on secession. You had Governor Madison Stark Perry at the time, who was a staunch advocate for states' rights. And when John Milton took over as governor after Perry, he pushed the Confederacy agenda even harder. Milton famously said something like, "Death would be preferable to reunion," which pretty much tells you where he stood on the matter. They saw secession as the only way to protect their economy and their way of life, if you will. Okay, so we've established that Florida was one of the first states to secede, but what did that actually mean in terms of the war effort? I mean, Florida was small, right? Not a whole lot of people, not a big industrial base. So what did we contribute to the Confederate cause? Well, that's where it gets interesting. We weren't sending massive armies to the front lines, but we were supplying the goods that kept the Confederates fed and fighting Florida sent around 15,000 men to fight for the Confederacy, which, isn't a huge number compared to some other states. But these guys were spread out across a lot of major battles. Florida troops fought in places like Gettysburg, Chickamauga, and Antietam, so they were definitely in the thick of it. But really, our biggest contribution wasn't manpower, it was food. Florida was a major supplier of cattle and other agricultural products for the Confederate Army. Let's talk about cattle for a minute. Cattle was a big deal here. Florida had vast open ranges, and the cattle industry was already well established before the war. Florida ranchers were driving herds up through Georgia to supply beef to Confederate troops. And as the war dragged on, this became more and more important. You see, as the Union started blockading the southern coast and destroying farmland in places like Georgia and Virginia, Florida's cattle became like essential. The Confederates needed food, and Florida was one of the few places still supplying it. Now it wasn't just cattle. Florida also produced salt. Yep, salt was crucial for preserving that meat, especially when you're trying to feed an army spread out over hundreds of miles. Without refrigeration, salt was the only way to keep food from spoiling. And the salt works here in Florida were churning out massive amounts of this stuff. You had salt production sites along the Gulf Coast, places like St. Andrews Bay, St. Mark's, and Cedar Key. It was all hands on deck. In fact, by the middle of the war, Union forces started targeting those salt works because they knew how important they were. There were Union raids along the coastline aimed specifically at destroying Florida's salt production. And let me tell you, it became a real problem for the Confederacy when those salt works got hit. I mean, you lose salt, you lose the ability to preserve meat, and you've got a whole army going hungry. It's a domino effect. Another thing that made Florida valuable to the Confederacy was its coastline, long, rugged, and perfect for blockade running. So what's that? Well, when the Union Navy set up blockades around southern ports, they were trying to cut off the Confederacy from supplies, especially foreign goods like weapons and ammunition. But Florida's coastline was so extensive, and there were so many little inlets and hidden ports that blockade runners, basically fast ships, could slip through the Union's grip and get supplies in and out. Ports like Apalachicola, St. Mark's, and Cedar Key were all involved in this. And, it wasn't just small-time operations. Blockade running was a high-stakes game with folks trying to smuggle in everything from weapons to luxury goods like cigars. It's kind of crazy to think about people risking their lives to bring in cigars when there's a war going on. But, that's what was happening. Some blockade runners got caught, of course, but a lot of them made it through, and it kept the Confederate war effort going just a little longer. So what does this all mean? Well, Florida's contribution to the Confederacy was kind of like the unsung hero of the war. We weren't sending massive armies into battle, but without Florida's food, salt, and ports, the Confederacy would have been in even worse shape than it already was. Florida's efforts helped keep the war going longer, even if, in the end, it wasn't enough to turn the tide. And I think that's a good lesson in how history isn't always about the big flashy moments. Sometimes it's the smaller behind the scenes stuff that really makes a difference. So Florida may have been small, but its role in the Confederacy was pretty important when you dig into it. Before we wrap up today, I want to make sure y'all know where you can dig deeper if you're as curious about this stuff as I am. There are some great resources out there that really help put Florida's secession and Civil War contributions into context, way more than I could cover in one episode. So I'll drop these links in the show notes. First off, the Florida Memory website is a treasure trove. They've got original documents like the actual ordinance of secession that Florida signed back in 1861. You can see the signatures of the folks who made it all official. It's a great place if you're into primary sources and want to see history straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. You can find timelines and photos too, which really bring the whole period to life. You'll find plenty to keep you busy for hours. Another solid spot is the Museum of Florida History. They've got an entire exhibit called Florida in the Civil War. And even if you can't make it there in person, their website offers a lot of info on how Florida's economy worked during the war. They talk about how Florida's cattle and salt production kept the Confederacy supplied, as well as what life was like on the home front for those who stayed behind. They even cover the impact of Union occupation in places like Key West and Pensacola. If you're looking for more of a deep dive into like the broader causes of secession and how Florida fit into the whole picture, the American Battlefield Trust has some good articles. They give you a sense of the strategic importance of Florida's ports and how the Union blockade affected the state. Plus, you can read about some of the lesser-known skirmishes and battles that took place here. They're great at breaking down the nitty-gritty military stuff if you're into that side of history. And hey, if you're more into reading books, a classic is The Causes of the Civil War by Kenneth M. Stampp. It dives into the political and social reasons behind secession, including how states like Florida viewed Lincoln's election and why it pushed them over the edge. And for something more Florida specific, there's Journal of the Proceedings of the Convention of the People of Florida, which is exactly what it sounds like. Notes from the actual secession convention in Tallahassee. It's pretty dense, but if you really want to hear what those leaders were debating, it's the real deal. Whether you're a history buff or just curious about how Florida's past shaped the nation, there's a lot out there. I mean, this is a part of history that's messy, complicated, and, well, important to understand if we want to get the full picture of our state's story. So, yeah, definitely check those out. And let me know if you dig up anything interesting. I always love hearing from y'all. All right, folks, that's going to wrap up today's episode. I hope y'all learned a little something about Florida's role in the Civil War. Let me know what you think. Did you know Florida was such a big supplier for the Confederacy? Shoot me your thoughts and suggestions for future topics. There's always more to uncover here on Old Florida Now. This is Bo Carter signing off. Stay curious and keep digging into that history, y'all.
Thanks for listening to Old Florida Now. Stay tuned for more stories from the Sunshine State's past. Until next time.